Hello, this is Joxon, and welcome to episode 2 of me breaking down the lore of my universe. In this episode, I will be going through the main storyline, alongside a couple of the storylines that follow. Usual disclaimers at the start. Number 1 is that this clicking is still going to be there. Number 2 is that I'm doing this all in one run, and some of these stories aren't entirely finished, so I might not remember all the details. Some of them might go by quickly, but hopefully everything will be here that's important. And finally, I'm recording this during day instead of the last episode, which was recorded at night, so there might be cars going by, there might be sounds in the house. Hopefully it doesn't get picked up, but you know, we'll find out. It's not like this particularly high quality anyway. So anything down the middle line here is the main storyline. Everything filters back into this at some point or another, and this is all very cohesive. Over here on the side of the blue, we have the third dimension characters, which is the sci-fi setting. And then over here on the purple, we have the corner characters, which are mostly Umrali, but it's also just anything else that doesn't exactly fit into the timeline. It's anything that isn't in the third dimension, basically. So the third dimension's story begins with the Great Expansion. And this is where the sci-fi setting expands across the entire Milky Way galaxy, which is our galaxy. Very nice. At some point they realise that they can't go beyond our galaxy for some reason or another. And that's sort of where the Great Expansion kind of ends. This is more of a prequel one. The same with Beginning of Attrition, because Beginning of Attrition sort of follows up where the Great Expansion leaves off and picks up where the war begins, because they realise they can't expand any further, and therefore everyone wants what's available, because now we know exactly what is available. The first true story is oh my god, that has been cycled awfully. The first true story is a cycle of breaking cycles. This is the introductory story. This is what you'll see first. These two could come at any time. And they're sort of to look back on the past, but this is quote-unquote modern day. This is the good start point. This introduces us to Alistair Laidlaw. Shout out to the real-life Laidlaw that I know, who allowed me to use his second name. Thank you. So Alistair Laidlaw, and also two other characters that are from the two different factions of the main story, because there's the three factions which I mentioned last time, which is the Galactic Union of Power, which is Alistair Laidlaw. We also have a erotic character who comes from the New Age Kingdom, and we have some sort of anthropomorphic animal that comes from the United Species Alliance. They're basically tasked with ending the war, so to put it, which is the cycle that's going to break the cycle. There's always some new technology that's made that's going to end the war and have one side win. And usually there'll be mercenary groups like this from all across the factions that just want to do it to have the war come to a close. Throughout the story, we get to learn that Alistair's quite the lucky guy, and he sort of keeps getting out of scrapes. And eventually his two allies die. But at the end of the story, he's still alive, and he pulls off the mission. But he sort of realises that it didn't really matter in the end. They're working to try and put a bomb in a certain place that's supposed to end it, but in the end it doesn't do much of anything but make the war worse, if anything. Instead of following down the straight line now, I am going to jump to the luckiest man alive, because this follows Alistair's story continuing. Alistair's kind of the generic main sci-fi character. I kind of just want this grounded character for any audience to recognise immediately and understand what their point is. So Luckiest Man Alive is Alistair's solo story. And in this we discover that he's really lucky. This is my excuse for having plot armour. Some characters have an innate luck to them, where they can just sort of get out of any scrape. They can get away with stuff that usually other characters wouldn't be able to get away with. And so this is where he sort of gives up the idea of being a mercenary and just fighting for anyone, and picks up the idea of fighting for other people, but on his own terms. He doesn't do it for profit, he does it because he knows that basically he can't be killed. He's too lucky. so he puts himself in the way of danger for others. It's kind of like a superhero, but it's more of a one-man army than a superhero. Still very grim. Loads of people still die. But it's sort of him coming into himself as a bit more of an interesting character than just a generic main character. I am then going to continue across the main storyline here to Exo 3. Exo 3, or Zo 3, it's a bit of a pun, introduces this character here, Zooey. It sort of jumps back and forth a bit. The story's in medias res, and we sort of learn about this character called Zooey who just is living her life, and she hops from planet to planet, and she just sort of helps people, and she's just trying to get by in life. And she ends up being kidnapped by the fourth faction, which is the Conglomerate, and experimented on. And eventually she breaks free. This story will have to have a separate breakdown at some point. Eventually she breaks free. And it's sort of something that never happens with the Conglomerate. The Conglomerate is a very clean organisation. They don't have anyone break free like this. So I consider it a main event story because it sets up some stuff that's going to happen in the future. I think for the next part we want to go to Delinquenthood. This introduces these four characters here: Corbin, Katie, Joe and Charlotte. Basically this is just four characters that are, as you might have guessed, delinquents, and they go around one planet called Optifax, which they just commit crimes. That's sort of it. Eventually Corbin goes too far and he ends up killing a child, and everyone turns against him. But he's like, we've got this one last job and I'll make it up to you by having this job be so great. He wins everyone over to do this one last job, which ends up being trying to get wire from a nearby facility. And everyone but Katie dies, basically. Just a bit unfortunate, but you know, that's how crime goes, isn't it? So, Delinquenthood leads directly onto the fall of Optifax and the rise of Wire. Bit of a long title. Not sure if I'll keep all of it might just be the fall of Optifax. This is the one of three key events that lead to Wire being as big of a threat as it is. So obviously, after their failed attempt at raiding the base with Wire, a lot of that Wire ends up getting free, and it spends about a week, mostly subterranean, collecting mass, growing, and then in about 3 days, the entire planet of Optifax falls, and everyone's dead. And that is sort of the first true beginning of Wire. Something that happened beforehand, which is one of the three main events that sets off Wire being such a big threat, is the JB Project. The JB Project is actually where I get the name for this channel, because it centres around digoxin, lanoxin, taloxin, and JB69. So the JB Project is on the front part of the New Age Kingdom, and it's meant to be a project to try and create a fully sentient synthetic to fight on the front lines that can still be mass produced, but they think and act like any normal person would, and they have flesh and blood and whatever. And this ends up going through digoxin, who's a massive failure, to lanoxin, who's a bit too lethal, to taloxin, who ends up failing because of Wire, to JB69, who ends up coming in much later, but so JB69 isn't actually part of the JB Project's story, but it leads off from that. And this is one of the three for Wire becoming an issue, because the actual reason for the JB Project is testing how Wire can be used in mass-producible forces. And of course, with so many failures, with basically all those characters being failures, it ends up getting free because they discontinue the models and just leave the models to roam, and whatever Wire is inside of them is now spread across the galaxy. Trying to think of what's next. there's supposed to be a connecting line here, actually, between Delinquent Hood and Guns, Bombs and Ash. Basically, Katie, after surviving the events of Delinquent Hood, goes on her own sort of adventure to find herself, so to put it. I'm rethinking for a second. So she goes on her own adventure to find herself, and she becomes sort of a bit of a space pirate outlaw. She doesn't really learn from the lesson of not committing crime, but she learns not to get caught. Let's put it that way. And eventually, she ends up joining the main cast. But this is sort of a solo story to explain what she's been doing outside of the events. I think that leads us up to Common Enemy. Common Enemy is where the three main factions of New Age Kingdom, Galactic Union of Power, and the United Species Alliance finally end their war and join forces together to an extent to face against Wire, because Wire is growing as a bigger threat. It's growing faster and faster and faster, and even the conglomerate's concerned about it, which is, when you know something's up. So the Common Enemy is where everyone sort of teams up begrudgingly to try and combat Wire, because Wire is becoming such a serious threat that there's no reasonable way to keep up the war anymore. Because otherwise it's going to be mutually assured destruction, and Wire would win without a doubt. So that's what happens there. This is where we have Alistair join up with the story. This is also where we have the rise of and fall of Optifax really come into main play. The potential story of Cut Squad could also join in here. I'm not sure how I feel about these characters. Any characters that are in brown are stuff that I'm not sure about. So, some people watching this video will recognise these names as well. This is during a time where I wasn't quite so creative. Cut Squad is basically a squad that's set up specifically to combat Wire, and they get their own little solo story of 4 of them. It's a bit like Halo Reach. It's sort of the idea of emphasising the power of Wire, because one by one they sort of end up falling victim, despite the fact that they're specifically sent for that. I'm not sure if I ever really want this to be a real story. I'm not sure if I want this to be its own solo story. I'm not sure if I want them to just be part of Common Enemy, or if I want them to be down to the wire. But ultimately, I think these characters do exist. I'm just not sure where. Common Enemy ends sort of when Wire is reaching its peak. That's not right. It ends sort of where Wire is really becoming like a super serious threat. Everyone's finally fully believing, yes, we're going to have to fight together, and teaming up with the conglomerate, and they create the SMG, or Super Massive Gate. Basically, it's supposed to be a time travel device. Functionally, it doesn't do that at all. It's triggered at the end of Common Enemy, and I imagine if it was a movie, we'd get this nice shot of a hand reaching through, and then the movie ends. And we'll pick that up in just a second, because I want to quickly go through the corner storyline very quickly. So, Brace of Illumini. And I'm trying to find the name, I've lost them. Corundum, Legend of Luck, is what a Brace of Illumini is about, because Corundum is an Abrasive Illumini, it's a metal. So, this is about a character who's very lucky, again, and starts to spur this movement of atheism in Umrali, because Umrali is a heavily religious place, and spurs this movement of atheism that doesn't really take off at the time, and he does his best, and ultimately he kind of ends up dying at the very end. I might be noticing a theme here, to be honest. But he doesn't make it. But later on, during A Tale of Two Priests, his atheism does sort of end up getting a cult following, and several hundred people rally behind the idea. So why would they do that? Why did it suddenly get traction? Well, A Tale of Two Priests is about Mal and Asur's ultimate war against each other. These two characters will absolutely get their own breakdown together, but because they're because they're so interconnected, I think when I do a character breakdown of them, that it's going to be both at the same time. Ultimately, Asur stops believing in the way of Omni-Ocnian, which is the religion that's been there for millennia. And she starts supporting Divinity. I mentioned this briefly in the first episode. This sparks a civil war between the two, with Usur inspiring hope and bringing the majority of people under them, with Mal inspiring power and keeping the same order. And although he doesn't have as many people, they're sort of stronger people. And this A Tale of Two Priests basically follows their whole story of fighting each other, of their reasons, their goals, of Usur growing more and more desperate, of Mal fighting to keep what he's built all this time, and eventually comes to a culmination where Mal and Usur have a duel one-on-one, and Mal ends up winning. And this is the main story of Umrali. This is probably one of the longest stories, if not the longest. And we'll see that when we go into it fully in a character breakdown, because the story itself is the story of these characters, ultimately. Although Mal does go on to the rebuilding of Umrali. Rule again, Brown, and these two have got question marks. I'm not sure if I either want these at all or if I make them the same story. The rebuilding of Umrali, you might have guessed, is the rebuilding of Umrali after the Civil War, after so many people have died, after everything's in ruin. Mal tries to piece back together with whoever will stay by his side. Which is, most people, they don't really have much of a choice by that point. So we also have the Communion of Higher Powers over here, specifically. And this is sort of a story where we get introduced personally to Ocnia, the Dark Lord, who is basically the god of this universe. And Silvani, we're not going to read her real name, the Säfärsphere Queen. A queen is one step in deity above a lord, and this is the only time we ever really see a queen. But it's sort of them checking up and making sure that Ocnia is doing a good job, and it's ironically just a bit before the huge mess up of Exo 3, which leads to Common Enemy. And it's sort of set to be like, here's these characters and this is what's actually going on behind the curtain, and this is what things look like when they're right. Now prepare to see things as they go very, very wrong. These two could definitely pair up together because they were both on a very zoomed out scale. It's not really about the characters. It's more about the events that are happening. So this could end up just being a very short story that's saying, here's what's going on meanwhile. Very quickly I want to cover Anafabula. Anafabula is a introduction to the character Dinicus, the Disjointed Lord, and it's also the Sayonara of that character. He's only in this story, really. He's kind of in all the stories, but he's not really in any of the stories, and that's why he's kind of got this timeline that goes up and down the whole chart. Because he's kind of everywhere and nowhere at once. It's my one horror story that focuses fully on horror. And it's about Dinicus, who goes into people's minds and makes them absolutely crazy, and it's about a group of people who team up to try and help their friend who has currently got Dinicus messing with them. It's a bit of a weird story because I don't know where I would really want to put it, because it can just be put anywhere. It could be put in any dimension, it could be put at any point in the timeline. Really, I'm not sure where this story belongs. But I do want to make the story. So it sits here on the side, and it's sort of a view of other lords. Because the only lord that we really meet is Ocnia, because he's the lord of the Säfärsphere. So the Disjointed Lord is sort of just a hint towards the fact that there is something beyond the Säfärsphere, but it never really truly influences the stories. Finally, we've got Daughter of Umrali. This is a character, this is a solo character story of a character that I really need to break down. This is the re-mentioning of Sal, Daughter of Umrali. Sal disappears sometime between Abrasive Illumini and A Tale of Two Priests. She falls off a building, vanishes into thin air, and that's sort of what kicks off the Tale of Two Priests, because it leads to Usur leaving, because Mal fails to look after their daughter, even though it's not entirely Mal's fault. But regardless, this tells the story of what actually happened. And this is another one where it's placed here for convenience, because it's about where it ends. But ultimately, she's kind of jumping through time constantly, and it leads to her from, at the time she's a very young adult, so it leads to her from being quite angry quite angsty, very aggressive, to becoming a lot more calm and collected, and eventually this very significant character, where we learn that where her father Mal is the embodiment of war and his Sir is the embodiment of magic. Sal was never really anything, but we eventually discover she's actually the embodiment of luck. There's luck coming into play again, as with many of the main characters here. But she is... If Alistair Laidlaw is the luckiest man alive, she's the luckiest woman alive. Sal's the luckiest woman alive. Very important character. And it leads us directly to Down to the Wire here, which is where we're in the end game of the stories now, that's why it's red. This is sort of the end of part 1. These two stories connect into the end of part 1. That hand that was reaching through the SMG that I mentioned earlier, that would be Sal's hand. The SMG doesn't time travel, which is what it was made to do. We're getting back on topic now, finally. The SMG does not time travel. The SMG ends up sort of channeling luck and pulling a series of characters through into this main timeline for the big finale. This is kind of like the Avengers Endgame moment. I promise you that I made this up before Avengers Endgame was out. I'm not ripping it off. I really, really promise. But this is where all the characters you've come to know and love fight Wire together. So Sal comes through, Mal and Oliver Raleigh comes through, which is what leads to New and Raleigh in the third dimension. Although Katie doesn't come through, she does show up later in the story to help. And we also have JB69, who also comes through the portal and joins. And this is where we have the full cast of all these characters here fighting together. I do want to quickly mention these three characters here, because I forgot. They're very significant in the common enemy. These are the leaders of the three different factions. So we've got Losretti Hawthorne? Hatheron? Losretti Hatheron. I think that's what I agreed on. It's a pretty new character. He's a funny bird man. He leads the United Species Alliance, which is the group that all believe all species are equal. So I thought it would only be appropriate that he's at the forefront of that. We also have Monarch, which is a supercomputer, and given that it's the science faction, the New Age Kingdom is the science faction. They're led by Monarch, which is a supercomputer who basically dictates everything. Given that the New Age Kingdom sort of stemmed from Britain, it only seemed fitting that they stayed under a monarchy. And this is proof that the Queen can never die. She just comes back as a supercomputer. Finally, we have Nalthea Nido. Kind of want a second name for her that's better, but Nalthea does for now. And she's the leader of the Galactic Union of Power. She's, very brash. She's very forefront. She fights head-on alongside everyone else instead of being much of a leader. She's more of a general. But she is considered to be the leader of the Galactic Union of Power. So I think I've now covered every character on here. Oh, of course I haven't, because I need to cover Cable, Voice of Wire. Cable, Voice of Wire finally comes truly into play Down to the Wire, and this is that foretold third reason that Wire sort of goes off the rails. Cable was once a scientist. Obviously his name originally wasn't Cable. And he was sort of at the forefront of the Wire project. And the power of it kind of just got to him a bit. And he ended up not only letting Wire free, but he ended up joining Wire, and he's the closest to a leader they have. He's not really the leader, he doesn't really control it, but he's sort of the embodiment of Wire, I suppose, and he speaks for it, since Wire itself can't exactly speak. It's Wire. I think that's all the catching up we need to do. So we probably meet him in Down on the Wire, where he's the main adversary, of course. And this is the escalating point. These two stories are sort of just interconnected. This is where eventually we see the death of a lot of characters. because this is the final stand. Wire grows stronger and stronger and stronger. They keep trying to fight it in new and different ways, constantly just being thwarted, and Wire gets stronger again afterwards. This is where, in a space battle, Alistair Laidlaw here tries to fight, and he sort of pushes his luck a bit too far, I suppose you can put it, although he kind of knew it was going to happen. His ship ends up getting shot down, he crashes into a planet, and although he survives the crash, because lucky, he does end up bleeding out on the frozen planet, because no one comes to help him, because everyone's still fighting up in space. This is where we get the... hang on, let's get some quotation marks. And then... oh, I'm not going to write. This is where we get the quotation marks of death of Sal. Sal, as mentioned in the first episode, ends up getting the Red Famine, which is in Umrali, which is what's driving it so chaotic. And it slowly but surely kills her. During a time in Daughter of Umrali, it's slowed because she's constantly travelling back and forward in time, and the virus doesn't really know what it's doing. Has some adverse effects on her body, of course. But with her stopped in Down to the Wire, where she's now got this sort of... even though she's got time abilities and she's fighting basically the strongest of any of the characters in the story, she's sort of dying still from the illness. And eventually she makes this big sacrifice sort of around the end of where we would consider Down to the Wire. And she stays behind to manually activate something and ends up dying from her illness. Which she knew was going to catch up to her eventually, and sort of other characters around you as well. I did make a mistake here, and I forgot to mention Thuru Thenk, the Unhinged Jester, who's kind of the orchestrator behind A Tale of Two Priests. He's sort of what drives Usa crazy to fight up against everything. He's sort of what the Communion of Higher Powers is about. That's why Silvani is checking in. And it's also he's significant in the rebuilding of Umrali. And he does end up coming through the portal, which I forgot to mention. He comes through the SMG, the Supermassive Gate, alongside Sal and Mal and all the other characters. And although Mal doesn't recognise Thuru Thenk because they never met, he's sort of a bit suspicious. He sort of knows something's up. This is where we get... back to the quotation marks. The death, quote unquote, of Thuru Thenk, who ends up getting consumed by Wire. He doesn't really help, he's not really a good guy, but he does end up fighting Wire because he recognises that Wire is not just a threat now to the third dimension, but is actually a threat to the universe. It's grown so rapidly. So he tries to fight, he ends up getting absorbed by the Wire, but ultimately I'm pretty sure this was his main plan. I'm saying I'm pretty sure as if I didn't write this. I'm quite confident in saying that this was his main plan, because he doesn't die and he ends up actually giving Wire the ability to travel dimensions just the same as him, which is what leads to Wire becoming super strong, and also leads to Strange Eons. Strange Eons has changed its name a lot. There used to be a world consumed, but I felt like that was a bit too on the nose. Strange Eons is now a reference to Lovecraft, where it's even in Strange Eons, death may die. I don't remember the rest of the quote off the top of my head. I kind of want a different name for it, but I digress. Strange Eons is the final fight. Any characters that are still alive are fighting here. It ends up even going to Abruptum, if you remember from the first episode, is where Ocnia the god lives, and that's where, you know, we can sort of imagine this final scene, probably in slow motion, probably with a nice bit of music in the background that's very dramatic, and it's everyone losing. Wire wins. Wire goes on with the dimension abilities that got from Thuru Thenk to consume all the dimensions. It consumes Umrali. It consumes even Abruptum, and then it consumes beyond the Säfärsphere. Strange Eons is supposed to be a bad ending. Not as in, ooh, I don't think I like this ending. It's supposed to be as in the audience watches it and goes, wow, it's a bit grim. No one survives. except the two quotation mark characters, but shh, we'll get to that in a second. No one survives, and Wire consumes everything, and the war is lost. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow, is that the end of the story? Is that everything? No, that's the end of part 1. So let's scroll down. Let's scroll down a bit. Let's scroll down a bit. What have we got here? Oh, went a bit too far. We've got Cadus Caius storyline here. If you remember from part 1, Cadus Caius has storylines part 2 and 3 inside of it. This isn't done at all. This is what I'm currently working on. So I don't have any characters listed, I don't have any events listed, but I do have the main idea of the storyline. So we have Repressed Alliance, which is, I think there's around 7 protagonists. It's a very big crew in this fantasy setting. It's no longer sci-fi, it's no longer medieval like in Raleigh. It's fully fantasy. Talking like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and, that side of things. So, Repressed Alliance is the introduction of all these characters, where they're hired as mercenaries, classic Dungeons and Dragons kind of style, to fight for the king against this big beast that's rised from ages ago. And at this point, I sort of want the audience to be thinking, how is this part of the story? How is this still the Säfärsphere? Because everything's consumed and things aren't quite working well. Cadus Caius survives because of magic beating technology. That's the rule. Magic is stronger than technology. That's kind of why magic was so feared. So, partway through Repressed Alliance, we end up learning, the main connector here, that the beast that's been raised from thousands of years ago is a missing piece of the conglomerate chip from the third dimension that had been missing from the start. Ended up going through time or something or another. Geez, I wonder how that happened. Maybe it's the supermassive gate that they made that was supposed to go through time, and it worked, but it didn't. Anyway, Repressed Alliance has these characters going up against that, and for the most part, it's just a very normal story. It's, once again, it's a lot like the cycle of breaking cycles, where it's just supposed to be an introduction, because the real story starts with Thorn in the side. Now you might notice that little letter there, the Thorn, is only used really one other time, and that is in the name of Thuru Think. Because Thuru Think isn't dead. God, what a surprise, it's almost like I pointed this out, with the quotation marks. Thuru Think is still alive. Thuru Think comes back in Thorn in the Side to be the main villain this time. Before he was always sort of behind the curtain, before he was always sort of influencing things, but now he's finally the main villain, which we mean Thorn on the Side. This is sort of another through line to prove that things are still in the Säfärsphere. This isn't just some new storyline, and it has these characters sort of meeting him, figuring out what he's capable of, figuring out that he plans to put everything in absolute chaos, and ultimately deciding to split the party into 2 groups. Which starts this sort of flowchart timeline. So, on the blue side, we have stories that directly concern the Thuru Think progression, and on the left side, we have stories that concern the progression of, what did I name the character? The Destined. So the Destined is part of the main group, and it's like the weakest character of all of them, but it's said that at some point he's going to be the strongest. He's destined for greatness. The main quirk of all the characters in Cadus Caius timeline are that they have titles like the Shard Bearer and the Savant and the Grave Digger. Got names like that. And they all sort of have this unique thing that they're known for, and it shapes exactly who they are. And people that aren't known for anything are sort of the dregs of society, and they're not cared for. And that's what Thuru Think aims to change, which is, it sort of makes him a bit of a weird anti-villain kind of thing. Because he's kind of helping the people that don't have anything, but it's not the way the world's supposed to work in this storyline. So Thuru Think's a bit of a... You can sort of empathise with him as a villain in this story. So the city must survive. Believe it or not, follows the story of a city that must survive, that's constantly under torment from people not quite dying right and coming back to life. It's basically zombies, but not quite zombies. It's sort of the Dark Souls resurrection kind of deal. And that is the group of 4 out of the 7, which is brought up over here with the Destined. And eventually leads to Gods of Yore, which is a lot about figuring out that once back in time, it wasn't just Cadus Caius. There was the full Säfärsphere and everything, but Cadus Caius was sort of locked away, and back then there was obviously Ocnir and all these other powerful deities and stuff, and now it's only Thuruthenk, because Wire consumed everything. And eventually they sort of end up figuring out some ways that they might be able to defeat Thuruthenk. Meanwhile, we've got Follow the River, which is where the Savant instructs 3 characters who are doing the Thuruthenk storyline. How can I think of why here, you know? So sorry, very unprofessional. So, the 3 characters that are doing this, the Thuruthenk storyline, get instructed by a character called the Savant, who's sort of, they can't see and they can't hear, and they sort of just lay like, they're sort of a vegetable, entirely disabled most of the time, but every so often they wake up, so to put it, and they draw, they paint paintings that foretell some sort of prophecy, and direct those paintings to the correct people. So the painting is of this river, which they find, and they follow the river, which eventually leads to echoes of the daughter. Where have we seen the name daughter before? Where have we seen the word daughter before? God, I wonder. Might have something to do with the other quotation marks that we had. I'm not going to spoil it though, of course, because they start getting these visions, these echoes, of someone talking to them, instructing them on how to fight Thuruthenk. So while these guys are learning, while these guys are sort of getting and learning about the past and getting weapons, these guys are learning exactly how to combat Thuruthenk directly from someone that seems to have a suspicious amount of knowledge on the topic. So this all eventually ends up leading to Requiem for Madness. Had to say it in a cool voice. Requiem for Madness is where the 2 groups of the story meet up once again to be part of the full 7. The Destined sort of finds his path. The Echoes of the Daughter help direct everyone, and whereas the last story ended up very badly, the story ends up good ending, very nice. Bittersweet ending, though, I would like to think, because Thuruthenk had some motive behind his goals that was admirable, and of course it's one of the only remaining characters, or at the time really is the only remaining character from the original storyline, and he ends up dying. So that sort of leaves it where there's no characters, as far as we know, there's no characters from the original storyline that are still alive. Everyone's dead from the main storyline finally, and it fully opens up into being the Cadus Caius storyline. So of course, if I haven't done part 2, I definitely haven't done part 3, but I do have ideas. Part 3 is Destiny Unfolds. These are less names, these are more pointers to help me remember. So Destiny Unfolds, my idea for part 3 might be that the Destined ends up not really being a good guy and maybe goes a bit mad with power, maybe his destiny is to do something or another that's not good, and so he ends up being the main villain for part 3. The main goal of part 3 isn't that. It isn't fighting this villain. It's following the Echoes of the Daughter, which are talking again, despite the fact Thuruthenk is already, quote-unquote, thought to be defeated. And the Echoes of the Daughter are instructing them to go to what they defeated in the Repressed Alliance originally, which was, of course, the Conglomerate ship, and begin powering up this device again, and begin fixing it, which is, of course, very difficult, because they're in a fantasy setting, this comes from a sci-fi setting, so it of course takes the full span of part 3 to work on making that. Eventually, of course, they do make it, which jumps to around the end of part 3, quote unquote, which is the Angel of Future Days. The Angel of Future Days is Sal. Sal, the daughter of Imrali, back again. Because of her time abilities, she doesn't really die, but she dies in the first part at the end. Her sacrifice is a sacrifice, but it isn't a sacrifice. Her illness catches up to her, but she still lives. It's a bit complicated, and I'll again go into that in her main story. Ultimately, this device that they've been working on was the supermassive gate, or what remains of it after it went back in time to be the beast at the start of Cadus Caius and then ends up now, and it's sort of where time travel stuff gets a bit mixed up into things. But we get the Angel of Future Days, which is Sal's final form, so to put it. And once the thing's powered up, Sal steps out. She comes out, she's on the arena now, and it's the full reveal that the Echoes of the Daughter truly was Sal all along, guiding them to bring herself back into being in a physical form. And she ends up killing the Destined, because she's just more powerful. And really, the Destined... I don't know how I feel about the Destined yet. Maybe you will be the villain. I don't know. As I say, I'm still working on this. The Destined isn't the main focus. The main focus, the true focus, is putting that device back online, which unknowingly brings Sal back into existence. Sal then uses that device to time travel. The one time that time travel is actually successful. Time travel is attempted a lot of times in the stories, which I haven't really been mentioning. But time travel is attempted in travel, in trying to reset wire. The reason the Conglomerate were already working on time travel to begin with is because they wanted to reverse the effects of Exit 3. So many times time travel is attempted, but it doesn't work. Except this one time, where the portal is powered up, Sal goes back through the portal after it brings her into being, and time travels to when the SMGs originally opened. Or somewhere around then. I'm not exactly sure when she comes out. But also the soul of Thuru Thenk somehow gets through the portal at the same time, which also triggers the events that would end up to Imrali being created, which would end up to Cadus Caius being locked away, which would end up with, in the Great Expansion, the reason that they can't expand past the Milky Way galaxy is because of something that Thuru Thenk did. So he sort of sets in motion, he sort of sets the course of actions in motion all over again from the beginning. It was him pulling the strings all along, sort of. And of course, he doesn't remember any of this, despite the fact that the cycle's been going and going and going and going. He doesn't remember any of this, because during his time trapped in Imrali, his memories fade in order to keep him subdued. So he forgets that he's actually just part of this cycle that goes again and again and again. All he really remembers is that he did the things in the past, and then he wakes up in Imrali. So this split is off into two timelines after Sal goes backwards, which I would call Part 3B and Part 3C, because obviously the main storyline is Part 3A, I suppose. 3C would be what follows after they power the portal in Cadus Caius, and it's what these characters decide to do in the end, and what these 7 characters in Cadus Caius decide to do, and it's sort of their send-off, and it's what they'll be doing for the rest of their life. I guess they'll probably retire. It sounds like they've been through enough, really. So they'll probably retire, and these are the characters that get the happy ending of everything. Part 3B is Sal going back and correcting everything. She's been in this loop for who knows how long. Again, we'll go into how the time travel really works for her in her own episode. But she's been doing this loop over and over and over and over and over again, and it eventually culminates in her finally being able to predict events right, being able to push things in the right direction, being able to change this and that and just the tiniest little things around constantly, until eventually we actually end up probably back around the time of Common Enemy, where maybe Common Enemy, maybe Time of the Wire, where Y is defeated. There's still fragments of wire. Wire can't be entirely destroyed, but there's still fragments of wire. But wire never wins in the end. Eventually, after 3 parts and some side stories, wire does get defeated through some pretty cheap means. And the reason that I want this big ending is, well, for one, I quite like cyclical stories. 2 is that I realised that after years and years and years and years of working on this main lore of the first part, I decided that I could work on this forever. This is the main part of it, despite the fact it only takes up the first part. This is actually the main focus of my lore. So the fact that it's gone at the end kind of sucked. And the fact that I could just keep building on it forever meant that I would never ever actually get to that end, probably. The end would be too far away, no one would stick around that long. So, with Sal defeating Wire, and going back in time and defeating Wire, and I'd probably still end up dying from an illness anyway, because she doesn't get to outrun that. That's cheating. So, time travel Sal does still eventually die. Unfortunately. The idea is that Wire never takes over everything. Everyone would probably end up just going straight back to war, with only pockets of Wire still around, and never able to push itself back up to where it used to be. And it's the point where it opens up. And I would be happy to let absolutely anyone make their own stories in my universe, if they felt inclined. And I could make my own stories for as long as I wanted to as well after that. In a universe where things aren't going to end quite so cataclysmically. Things can just persist in sort of this era, before things went downhill. New and Raleigh is still, of course, there. So it's the interest of that new faction growing. I would love to tell the story of Dom de Dentes, who is an interesting character that I made but never fit into things quite right. And he would never have been a main story character, so what's the point? We would get to see characters like JB69, who only really just got introduced alongside Katie, who never got the chance to be a proper character. Now they have an open universe to do. The part 4, I suppose, although it wouldn't really be a part. But after all of this, with the time travel and the killing of Wire, the quote-unquote part 4 would be the continuance timeline, I suppose, where things just keep going. And that's ultimately where I want to leave my stories. Where it's open to anyone to continue them if they feel like it. They can make their own stories in the universe, and I can make my own little stories just for fun. But the main storyline of big epics and things leading up to bigger things, and, the universe being at stake in this story, or the way of nature of magic being at stake in this story, or a chance at redemption being at stake in this story. These big stakes aren't around anymore. And things quiet into still an eternal war, but one that's much more familiar. I think that's about all I want to say. I imagine in the next episode will be a in-depth character breakdown. If anyone would like to leave any comments on any ideas on what you'd like to see me cover next, I would love to hear it. If there's any characters that interest you, if there's any ideas of other things that I could do. So far I've got the idea of breaking down certain stories, breaking down certain characters, and breaking down certain locations. If there's any other ideas, I would love to hear them. Probably been a bit of a long episode, so thank you for watching all of it. And hopefully you managed to keep up with this spaghetti junction of a timeline. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all in episode 3, which will probably be a character breakdown.